At the Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
This episode of The Nocturnists was made possible with the support of the California Medical Association and Vocera Communications Experience Innovation Network. Learning medicine in the ICU is hard. The patients are sick, the hours are long, and sometimes you only have a few seconds to make a clinical decision. But what does this feel like when you're an ICU doctor in training? This is The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. In this episode, ICU physician Jeremy Topin tells a story that illustrates the highly pressurized environment of the ICU. After his story, Jeremy and I talk about developing the so-called clinical hunch.
I have learned to trust that a bit more, but what gets me more concerning is when that fails me.
Here's Jeremy.
So I've been up all night thinking about cinnamon rolls. More specifically, how to get to the bakery right at 5 a.m. when they open to buy cinnamon rolls. I don't want to get there early because that would mean I'd be losing out on some sleep. I don't want to get there late because I'm already going to struggle to get to the ICU in time this morning. So my brain has been wired all night trying to back calculate how early to get up to be there right at 5 a.m. It's got all these obstacles it has to overcome. I have to find a clean pair of scrubs. I need to find several layers of clothes because it's December in Chicago. I have to do this without turning on a light or making a sound because my wife and one-year-old son are in the bed. I absolutely cannot wake them up. I then have to go find my car, scrape, shovel, whatever ice has accumulated overnight. Then hopefully find a parking spot close to Ann Sather's. That's the restaurant where they make these fantastic cinnamon rolls. I navigate this pretty well. I'm there right at about 5. I buy a couple of boxes of these cinnamon rolls right out of the oven. They're piping hot. The glaze is melting. I'm watching them kind of in my car on Lakeshore Drive. It's everything I can do not to eat one. But now that mission's accomplished, I have the rolls. My brain can now focus on what it's been avoiding. That is, today is going to be my very first day as the senior resident on call in the ICU. So a little more context here. I'm a MedPeds resident. And so we do 3 years of pediatrics and 3 years of medicine, and we squish it all into 4. We rotate every 3 months between peds to medicine. So I'm always several months behind my categorical medicine colleagues. And they just always seem quicker, smarter, definitely more clinically confident than me. And nowhere does this imposter syndrome rage more than in the ICU, my intern year. There, things are so much faster. There's just volumes of information to try to deal with. The stakes are higher, organ systems that are failing. And I'm just in awe of those that seem to be able to navigate this space with ease. They can absorb and synthesize this information. They seem to recognize complex patterns of illness quicker than others. And those that do it well, they seem to be able to communicate and connect to these families, patients, during these really intense, often intimate times when they're discussing issues of end of life and death. And I realize this is what I want to do. There's this marriage of complex physiology and humanity, and it's drawing me to this profession. Yet I'm terrified of it. And I don't know whether to lean into the ICU or to run. So I've been really, over the last several months, trying to figure this out. I've been talking to my program director, I've been talking to the head of medicine, and they've given me the green light to do the ICU early in my second year instead of later in my third, which really feels like a questionable choice at this moment. But I've been preparing. I've been reading books on mechanical ventilation, the perils and the pitfalls. There's this definitive textbook of ICU medicine that I've been reading chapter after chapter on. It's written by these legends, these icons of ICU medicine, Dr. Hall, Dr. Schmidt, Dr. Wood. Did I mention Dr. Hall is my attending on service this week, who I'll be presenting to in the morning? He's kind of an imposing figure, book and all, sort of a more composed Kurt Vonnegut with a sport coat and a stethoscope around his neck. I make it to the ICU. I'm late. I take these cinnamon rolls. I drop them off in the nurse's station. The morning's pretty uneventful. It's pretty structured. There's lots of other doctors around, work rounds, attending rounds, radiology rounds, noon lecture. But as the day goes on, the attendings go home, the fellows kind of become sparse, and the other services start to sign out their patients to my team. I have 2 interns and a medical student. And as the sun sets, we're now alone, the ICU, just us and me. And it isn't long till my first challenge develops as one of the nurses calls me to see one of my cross-cover patients who's not doing well. I go to the room and he doesn't look well. He's got ribs that are sticking out under tight skin. His temples are concave. But it's not his wasted appearance that's worrying me. What's terrifying me are the strained muscles in his neck and this pursed lip breathing. He is struggling to breathe, probably from his pneumonia, his cancer, or a combination of the two. But he's now my responsibility. And my brain is firing. I'm thinking blood gas, antibiotics, chest x-ray, and I have to settle down. And I go to my checklist, A, B, C, airway, breathing, circulation, airway. He's got one, he doesn't look obstructed. B, breathing. There's our problem. Yeah. Looks like he's gonna need a ventilator. C, circulation, he's got a good blood pressure, at least for the moment. So the team and I, we decide he needs to be intubated. We call anesthesia, and we're getting ready. I'm being proactive. I've got IV fluids going because I'm anticipating some low blood pressure. I've already got the sedatives hung because I want to make sure he's calm and comfortable. Respiratory is bringing in the ventilator, and I've already told him the settings. We're waiting and waiting and waiting on anesthesia. He finally comes, intubates the patient, puts the breathing tube in. We hook him up to the ventilator, and he starts looking better. He's breathing more comfortably. His oxygen levels are good. I breathe. And there's just a little, maybe kernel of confidence developing. And then about 3 minutes later, it all goes wrong. His blood pressure drops precipitously low. I have to hold the sedation. Then he starts thrashing about in the bed. He's working even harder to breathe than he was before. The alarms on the ventilator won't stop firing. His oxygen levels are plummeting. I need to give him sedation, but that will make his already low blood pressure worse. I need to give him medicine to support his failing circulation, but that involves big IVs in the neck or the groin. And I've done a few, but never in a patient flopping around in the bed and in such dire straits as he is. I unhook him from the vent. We start bagging him, and his vitals get a little better. And I go to the vent, and now I'm trying different settings, now for severe pneumonia with high pressures and high oxygen. We hook him back up, and I watch the vitals, and again, they start to spiral down, and he's working again, and his blood pressure is plummeting. So we unhook him, we bag him. He looks a little better. I go back to the vent. I now try settings for severe COPD. I'm giving him smaller but quicker breaths. We hook him back up. Again, he starts to spiral downwards. And I'm doing this dance with him like 3-4 times where we unhook him. I try different settings. I hook him back up, hoping things will change. But again and again, he's really going from bad to worse, and now he's close to death. I cannot figure out his physiology. I don't know what to do. I turn to the nurse, call a code. She looks at me. He's not coding. He's got a pulse. And he's going to. I need more people here. I need help. So the code alarm goes out overhead for everyone to hear. About a minute later, I can hear the squeaking shoes of a lot of residents all coming to my rescue. Kyle and Chris are the first in the room, and I'm trying to explain to them what's going on. And as I go through the sequence of events, and I'm explaining how my patient continues to do worse when on the vent, but does a little better off, they exchange a knowing look with each other. They've recognized what I haven't. And Kyle turns to me and says, he has acute right heart failure. And I realize what I've missed. You see, the right side of the heart, the right ventricle, normally pumps deoxygenated or blue blood to the lungs. The lungs are close, they're not very far away, doesn't take a lot of work. The right ventricle is not very strong, it doesn't need to be. The left ventricle does the heavy lifting, it's pumping the rest of the blood to the body. And that's normally what we focus on when people are having trouble with their circulation. In my patient's case, when I put him on the ventilator, that increased the pressure in his chest. That increased pressure, that increased load was actually too much for his right ventricle, and it was failing. Right heart failure is difficult to treat when recognized, almost impossible if not appreciated. Chris goes to work and places that IV in his neck. Kyle goes to the ventilator and he's dialing in settings. He's using a mode that limits the pressure. This was a mode I hadn't thought of. 30 minutes later, my patient is quasi-stable, at least for the moment. Kyle and Chris and I, we sort of debrief a little bit. They have to go back, tend to the patients they have not been tending to, leaving me alone with my team, the patient, the nurse, and the ventilator that sort of sounds like it's hissing at me at the moment. I can't look anyone in the eye. Luckily, the rest of the night goes relatively uneventful. In the morning, I've got to kind of put myself together and put the sequence of events together for Dr. Hall. Kind of go through how everything went, the trial and travails, calling the code, Kyle and Chris coming to my rescue. Dr. Hall just sort of listening as I step back and sort of wait for his thoughts, his judgment. He just sort of puts a thumb to his chin and nods his head and says, okay, let's move on to the next patient. So we move on. Rounds end, and I'm exhausted, emotionally, physically, I'm drained. I go to the nurse's break room to get a much-needed cup of coffee. And as I walk in, I'm shocked. There's still a cinnamon roll left on the table. Somehow, it survived the last 24 hours. So did I.
So I am talking to Jeremy Topin. Jeremy, thanks so much for being with me this morning.
Oh, thanks for having me on the podcast.
I love the way you open your story with this journey to pick up the cinnamon buns.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed about our show in October on Out of the Comfort Zone is that food actually came up a lot in each story. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that food plays during these long nights in the ICU?
Yeah, food plays a huge role in the lives of stressed and overtaxed residents. It's natural to deal with sort of the stress of the day. I mean, I can't say how many times at 3 a.m. up at night and just looking from nurse station to nurse station, trying to find something that I could eat when nothing else was open. I mean, the life of a resident is based upon when that next meal is going to be, when do you have time, and you eat when you do have time because you don't know when you'll have it.
I agree, and I would love to say that during residency I planned ahead and I cooked healthy food and I put them into little Tupperwares and I brought the Tupperwares to work, and I knew that at 3 a.m. nothing would be open, and so I actually planned around it. But I didn't, and I think part of it is I was just way too depleted to have the reserve to do that kind of foresight. And so I found myself too pillaging the snack room and eating, these graham crackers and saltines that I would stuff into my pockets and just nibble on during the course of the night.
Yeah, I mean, I recall, there's a role, I was at the University of Chicago for residency, and there was a role called the MROC. It was sort of a floating resident each night, each day on call, and one of the responsibilities is you were to order dinner for everyone. You got to choose where in the South Side you wanted to order from, and you were responsible for everyone on call, or maybe 20, 25 people on call at a given night, to get their order, get their money, or place the order, pick it up, and get it to everyone, while you're also responsible for consults from the surgical services and whatnot. And there was one crazy night where I think there was someone in the neuro ICU and they had a head bleed, and they were asking my advice on whether or not they could anticoagulate them for a possible PE. And I'm wrestling with this big decision, and I've got everyone paging me like, where's the food? Where's the food? And I'm like, really? But I mean, that was a crucial role. I mean, like, I was responsible. It was like 6:30. They were supposed to have the food. And I felt pretty bad about that. I was shirking my responsibility.
So, Jeremy, I've been thinking a lot about how medicine is both an art and a science, but that feels even more extreme in the ICU. And so, you have all of the checklists. Like in your story, you talk about, a patient is sick, what do? You go down the list, A, B, C. Or, when a patient codes, we go through the H's and T's. Or when a patient has really poor oxygen levels, there's all these protocols that we follow with the ventilator. And so a lot of it is really regimented. But as I said, there is also this art to it. Like, often we're operating in this evidence-free zone and just kind of winging it and proceeding and moving forward based on our intuitions. And I think this is true of medicine in general, but in the ICU, when people are really sick, it just feels more, that contrast feels more heightened to me. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit what it's like to be in that headspace.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. There's been this drive to sort of protocolized medicine, and very much so in the ICU, especially with sort of these order sets that we have when patients get admitted through the EMR, electronic medical record. And you do need safety mechanisms and checklists and protocols to sort of make sure you're not forgetting some of the things that become mundane but are very important. At the same time, you really need to also trust that first gut reflex of when you see a patient. Like, how do you feel about them? Are the warning bells going off or not? And that's not a checklist kind of thing. It's sort of a gestalt sort of thing. And I think you need that. You need both. It took a while to be comfortable with all of that, but at 15 years in, this is sort of hopefully where I'm at my best, sort of up to date and current with sort of medicine, but also have that experience to be able to bring to my patients.
Yeah, I'd really like to zoom in on this idea of clinical hunch, or this like intuition that you're talking about. And it reminds me of this time when I was on the wards as a resident a few years ago. And there was an attending on who, was sort of at the peak of his career, had been practicing medicine for decades upon decades. And he was pretty hands-off and let me do my thing. But there was this one day where we rounded on a patient, stepped out of the room, and he piped up and he said, "Can we send a TSH on this patient?" And we all looked at him and we were kind of like, well, why? It didn't really make sense. And he said, "I don't know. He just looks to me kind of like someone who would have hypothyroidism." And I was like, what? And so we kind of humored him and we sent off this TSH, and lo and behold, it comes back and it's abnormal. And I said to him, "How did you know?" And he's like, "Honestly, I don't even know. It's just this weird feeling that I got when we were in the room." And so I'm wondering, now that you're 15 years into your career, have you ever had moments like that where you almost like can't even answer? Has that ever happened to you?
Yes. The ICU is such a place with such high volume and throughput, and it's crazy. And we, for every 3 or 4 or 5 patients that get admitted, often they're just in case. And so there often at times can be just sort of a complacency amongst the residents and medical students as they sort of first see the patients and they present, and they sort of have this impression that the patient is relatively stable. And you walk in the room and you're like, whoa, that's wrong. That's not right. And it's often not exactly something you can put your finger on. Your brain is sort of processing before you even appreciate it. And I have learned to trust that a bit more. It's not always right, but, sometimes it's just the look. It's just sort of the breathing of the patient. It's just the whole appearance. It just feels off. But what gets me more concerning is when that fails me. I remember there was a patient, a patient comes in, DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, and they're, Usually they sort of run of the mill. They, for whatever reason, haven't taken their medicine or they've got a viral illness, and they sort of run their course. Once you get them on an insulin drip, they tend to do quite well. And I went in, I saw the patient, I did my exam, and nothing really was particularly concerning, and walked away and told the resident, sure, they're fine, and really didn't put too much more thought into that patient until 12 hours later on the insulin drip, they were worse, way worse, and ended up having an abdominal crises, abdominal infection, and ended up having to go to surgery. And, I missed it. The labs, in hindsight, there was probably more of an acidosis than had been appropriate, that in hindsight, maybe if I'd zeroed in on, I would have dug deeper. But those are the ones that I find the most, they're scary because you sort of feel you fail, that I didn't pick it up. But hopefully you can go back and get some insight from it so that you'll have that right instinct the first time or the next time.
I was really struck by the moment in your story where your co-residents come in, they make the diagnosis, they switch the vent settings, they stabilize the patient, and then they leave, and you're left there standing in the room. And I think we as an audience, we can kind of feel this emotion that washes over you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, that moment was really, I was failing, and I both, more than just failing on a test or an exam. I mean, you as a human, a person who you're charged with caring for in front of you, and that setting somewhat of life and death, not trying to make it more dramatic than it is or was. But you're also doing it in front of everyone and yourself. And at that point, it was such a fragile moment in my career in terms of, is this the right path? And am I capable? Am I smart enough, able enough? So that sort of all came together in one moment there.
And we talked a little bit about how your residency was actually really supportive in a lot of ways. Like, if you don't know something, like, you're on a growth curve, like, you're actually right where you should be. And that was what people said. But how there was this undercurrent, sort of like hidden messaging that contradicted that actually gave the message, like, it's not okay if you don't know. And there was one little anecdote that you shared with me that I was wondering if you could share with our audience.
Sure. I do stand by the program, and I do feel the program was very supportive. But yeah, there was a moment, I was an intern, and it was a busy admitting day. And I'm always 2-3 steps behind everything that's going on. But we were admitting a patient, I think, that was being transferred to our service with actually cor pulmonale. And the two seniors were talking to each other, the one who was transferring the patient to our service. And they were just talking a mile a minute, and I really couldn't keep up with understanding the physiology as they were describing it. And I sort of jokingly just raised my hand, and they looked at me, and I was like, I don't get it. And they're like, what? I'm like, I don't get it. Can you explain that to me? I'm not following you. And not my senior, but the other senior just gave me a look like, whoa, like, what do you, I realized that was the wrong thing to say. Like, I should not have admitted I didn't understand it, or at least maybe not in the manner that I did. And obviously the message there was like, don't admit that you don't know something, which, although that incident happened, I don't feel that was the dominant culture around me. But I do feel that, just in general, the type of people that we are, that find themselves in medicine, it is hard to admit when you don't know something. It is hard to declare that maybe you're not as sharp or as current as the people around you, or as capable as the people around you.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's unique to your program. I think this is just a larger aspect of the culture of medicine. And I'd just like to throw out there, like, why? Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's not okay to talk about things like doubt, uncertainty, and so on and so forth?
I think the feedback structure in medicine and in training is just all wrong. I think we focus on the bad outcomes, the challenging cases. Like those are what stick in our head. It's what we take home. And they tend to take on this outsized proportion because we definitely don't pat ourselves on the back for the community-acquired pneumonia that gets admitted, and we pick the right antibiotic and we navigate them through a 2-3 day course of the hospital without really anything untoward happening to them. And they go back home, and that's just like a given. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. That's not even looked at as anything positive. And so, if we're going to take responsibility for the challenges, for our knowledge gaps, or when we're not so certain, we should also take credit for when things go well, and we don't do that at all.
Thank you so much for coming in and speaking with me today. It's been really, really nice to chat.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks so much for listening to our show. We'd love to hear your questions, comments, feedback, and reflections. So leave us a message on our hotline at 415-991-0958, and your voice could be on a future episode. This episode of The Nocturnists was sponsored by Vocera Communications' Experience Innovation Network, a network of healthcare leaders across the U.S. and Canada who are working to transform healthcare by restoring its human connection. I had the opportunity to speak at their conference this year, and they were really inspiring. You can learn more about them in our show notes. If you like what you hear, consider making a gift on our website. And if you're interested in coming on as a sponsor or having our team produce a live show in your town, get in touch. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association. I want to thank our executive producer, Allie Block, our head of story development, Adelaide Papazolo, our podcast producer, Liza Veal, sound engineer, Alberto Hernandez, and our communications director, Chloe Lassard. Our original artwork is by Lindsay Mound, our original theme song is by Yosef Monroe, and all other music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Please subscribe, rate, and review our show on Apple Podcasts. It actually helps. And of course, spread the word to your friends, family, and colleagues. We are the Nocturnists. See you next week.